this is Roger, thanks for dropping by. I'm going to try a little experiment which will need some days to pass to actually do, but what I'll do is this is the first bit and then when the days have passed and I get to the next bits, I'll film them again, and when I've finished the parts, I'll join them all together so that they make a single video. It may look a little disjointed, camera in a different position, but I'm hoping to sort of not only prove a point but make a point. But we'll see. You know what all experiments are like. Right, I picked on this plant for two reasons. One, it needs watering. This is Shelob Tolkien. So one, it needs watering, and two, this was repotted at the end of March and it's in pure Orchids bark. So there's nothing else been added, there's no moss in there or anything like that. It's just in bark. And in theory that is good quality bark. Not all bark is. Yeah? And the main difference between at the quality end and the not so quality end, quite honestly, is just how long it lasts. Yeah? The better stuff should last a considerable amount longer than the poor quality bark. Anyway, all I'm going to do at this stage is flush it. As I said, it does need watering. We had some feed in there last time. So I'm not worried about last time, I'm on about from this time forward. Yeah, so I'm going to flush it. This is just pure RO water. Okay, I think you'll agree that's a reasonable flush. That was about 1.5 litres of water poured through there. I doubt if most people use that much unless they've got a hose on their plants. That's a different thing. I can't do that. So that's a good flush. And because I want to be absolutely certain of where my start point is, I'm going to come back in half an hour and do that again. Won't hurt the plant. I know the plant's absolutely soaking wet now, but you have to bear in mind when a plant's soaking wet, it can't actually get any wetter, can it? So I'm going to give that half an hour and then I'm going to do that again for that plant, and then that will be my start point. You don't need to see that bit, it's just a repeat of what I've just done, but I can assure you it will be done, and then tomorrow we'll come back and revisit it at this sort of time of day, you know, roughly. So it'll have had about 24 hours, and then we'll have a look and see what I'm trying to get at and whether there is anything to worry about or not. So, see you tomorrow. I thought this might work better with two plants. All my reasoning and everything like that will come out at the end, not at the beginning. This is a Restrepia. Yeah, this is in bark and moss, small bark and moss. That's also important. Yeah, this was repotted in October last year, so this is not new media. Yeah, trust me, but this plant was actually flushed yesterday, but I'm going to do it again. Yeah, because I want my start point. Yes, so I'm going to, I mean, this is already soaking wet, but it's a Restrepia and it's going to be a hot day. It'll be probably over the moon. So I'm going to pour a fair bit of water through it. I want to make sure that both you and me believe it's been flushed. Especially bearing in mind it was flushed yesterday. Okay. Right, so that's another one done. And I'll this is Restrepia Howleysay. Yeah. And we'll be back tomorrow and we'll revisit the two plants. Okay, before I continue with this video, 24 hours have passed, give or take an hour. This isn't a science lab, for hell's sake. But I just want to show you my start point, and my start point is that I want my meters clean. Yeah? So they've been sat in some pure RO water for about half an hour, just to make sure if any deposits or anything were on the units that actually do the measuring, it should have dissolved okay, and I can give them a sluice round in pure RO water, and then when I start, I know they're clean. Yeah, therefore their reading should be as accurate as those meters can do. And just on that point, this is quite a good instrument. I've had it quite a while. It still gives true readings based on, I know it sounds daft, but I know what my RO water is and I know the readings it should give. You know, if I start reading my pure RO water with either of these 2 meters and they start giving different readings, one of 2 things will be wrong. Either the RO unit needs some membrane or filter replacement because they're not working as well as they used to. That's quite easy to check. Or the meters need recalibrating, or they've had their day. You know, nothing lasts forever. Okay, so the TDS meter is pretty accurate. They don't really go off. They're not bad. As far as pH meters are concerned, there are pH meters on the market that you could call a scientific instrument. They are delicate. They go to 2 decimal places. Yeah, and it's important to really look after them properly if you want them to stay as a scientific instrument, as opposed to just being a rough guide. That is the cheapest pH meter on the market. It only goes to 1 decimal place, and because I broke my old one, I had to get a new one. And I thought, well, if I'm going to start thinking about pH more seriously, I need to know that the meter's start point is right. So I did calibrate it, and I meticulously calibrated it to get myself a start point. And with a bit of help from others, I wasn't looking after my old one properly, because before I put it away, I wasn't rinsing it. So I was leaving deposits on the little delicate bits. You don't want deposits on your delicate bits. So, I mean, a little change like that, just having a glass of pure RO water to one side after a watering session and giving these instruments a quick rinse before I store them, I'm sure does them the world of good and will extend their life. And is that difficult? No. So I'm happy to do that. Having done that, when I get them out to use them, I already know they're clean, so I don't need to rinse them again, do I? You don't need to do it at both ends. But certainly before you store them away, it would pay to rinse them off, make sure they're clean. Yeah? And quite honestly, the units that do the measuring are up inside the base. So drying the base off is not going to do any good at all, quite honestly. You're not touching the units inside. And quite honestly, you shouldn't be messing with those. Don't go poking around up inside the base of the meter where the delicate bits are. You don't want your delicate bits poked around, do you? So you can look after your kit in a very simple way. But that's where I wanted to start from, is the fact that the 2 meters have been cleaned. And in addition to that, that's been cleaned and dried. Because what I'm going to do next is going to involve small amounts of water. The smaller the volume of water, the more effect you get by sticking stuff in that water, if you see what I mean. The larger the volume, the less effect you have with the same amount of stuff. So that's my start point to carry on with this little experiment. And this experiment's not scientific, it's just to show something that happens and the degree it happens. It's a food for thought. Okay, this was our first test plant for the purposes of this thing, and this one was deliberately picked because this is quite a vigorous grower. That's semi-important, but it's in relatively new media and it's just bark. Now this was absolutely drowned yesterday in RO water. It was a good flush, yeah? As you can see, it's still moist, but it's already dried at the top. You know, we had a warm day yesterday, and you know, there's a lot of air in round this bark, so it does dry quite quickly. But that's the state it's in now. And what I'm going to do now is pour a relatively small amount through the pot. I'm not reflushing it because I want to gather the water that's coming out. Yeah, so I'm just going to pour a relatively small amount through. Just enough to start running out the bottom. Don't want loads. That's enough. I just want some test water out the bottom. And bear in mind what I said, the smaller the volume of water with the same stuff in it has a greater effect than a large volume of water with the same amount of stuff in it. Okay? Right, let's get the plant out of the way. We don't need that anymore, not today. And this was cleaned and dried before I started. So that water in there contains nothing more than what came out of that pot. And now, because I need to use my meters and that water's nowhere near deep enough to get a reading, I'm going to pour it into a clean glass to get some depth so that I can test it. Okay, that'll do. Right, now the science. Sort of. Remember, the water that went in there yesterday and flushed that thing out was at a TDS of around 10 and a pH of around 7. Give or take a point. Right, so it helps if you turn these things on. That's clean. Yeah? Let's see what we've got now. So I'm hoping this hasn't changed much. Right, the TDS reading is 15. It's gone up a bit. Yeah? So despite that flush, something's got in the water and raised the TDS value. The difference between 10 and 15, as far as feeding levels are concerned, is negligible. But there's been a slight change. Right. Always turn your meters off when you're finished using them. Your batteries will last probably longer than you will. Right, this is the one I'm hoping will prove a minor point. Now, look at it, you got me down on my flipping knees again, you lot. Right. Sluicing around is required with pH meters, even if you know they start clean. Yeah? They will often drop a little bit from their initial reading. If you put them away dirty, trying to get a reading next time you use it is actually quite difficult, because the first thing you're trying to do is wash the little electrodes off and get them clean again. Yeah? So put them away clean. Right, that says 6.7. That's 3 decimal places on the pH scale in 24 hours in relatively new bark in a pot that hasn't dried out properly yet. Point number 1. Right. That's the first plant. Now, for the purposes of this experiment, I'm going to clean these off again. Turn my meter off, back in the clean water so that I can give them a slosh. Now, unfortunately, to do this properly, I've got a contaminated glass and a contaminated bowl, so I'm now going to go and clean those off and dry them again, and then we'll get the other plant out. Okay, on to the Restrepia now. This was Restrepia Aliciae, I think that's said. Okay, now what's the difference between the previous pot and this pot? Well, I'll tell you, this is still soaking wet. And I mean soaking wet. Yeah? That's small bark and moss in there, and it's still soaking wet. So in 24 hours, what's happened in that media? That's what I'm after. Yeah? So let's pour, again, a relatively small amount of clean water through it, just to get enough to test. Just want stuff to come out the bottom, that's all. There we go. That's actually a bit too much, but that's because it's so wet, most of what I poured in's gone straight through. But for the purposes of what we're doing, that is what's wanted. Put your tag back in, with a memory like mine, which actually isn't that bad. I'm always taking the mickey out of my memory, but it is actually pretty good when it's relevant to me. You can give me a load of information that I'm not interested in and it will be gone. If I'm interested in it, it sticks. Right, let's get that in our clean glass. I have a feeling this is going to be a bit of an eye-opener for some people. Not for me, I know what's coming. Alright, we get our cleaned off TDS meter again, but with the TDS meter it wouldn't have made much difference. Okay. Now that's 18. Yeah? So the amount of stuff in that water, which in the main would be undissolved feed, yeah, is 18. So a bit higher. Don't forget this is 24 hours we're talking here. So that's gone up to 18. So it's different, higher. Now let's get the old cleaned off pH meter so that we start from the same point. .6. Yeah? It's gone down 2 decimal places more than the pure bark that's relatively new. So let's think what that's just done. It's gone down to 6.6, 6.7. It's flicking between the two, so because it doesn't go to 2 decimal places, it's somewhere between those. So maybe 1.5 points on the pH scale. Right. So what have I just shown? What I've just shown is that the media is affecting, I'm not so much fussed on that. I don't expect the plant to use all of the nutrients in the pot in 24 hours. It's not going to happen, is it? So I was expecting a little bit of, you know, feed to come out of that water because it hasn't been used yet. That's just logic. Okay, but the pH is important, yeah? The water that went into that pot was at a pH of 7. It was pure. That's what my RO water measures when it's clean. And it's now come out at 6.6 in 24 hours. How long do I expect my Restrepia to stay wet? The answer is forever, because it shouldn't dry out, ever. It's that type of plant. Very fine rooted system, yeah. Lives in a place where the humidity is heading up towards 100%. They are constantly wet, and I try and do the same thing for my plant. Right, now the point I'm trying to get at is the pH swing. What would happen to the water if I'd lowered my pH to do a swing low for my bark pot, the shelob, yeah? Let's say I went in at around 5.6, 5.7, below the magic 5.8. Now on the day that I watered my shelob Tolkien, that's how it would be. By the end of the next day, it would have changed, wouldn't it? And it's the media that's doing that. So the media would have taken my 5.6, 5.7 and moved it down to about 5.4. Is that something I want? Is it hell? Now let's think about the poor little Restrepia, and this is important. Yeah? What is the pH in that pot going to be after 4 days or 5 days? You can only imagine. That's got moss, small bark, and it's not brand new. So there is a decay going on in the pot at a certain rate. That's why they need repotting more often to refresh the media. So what would happen to that pot? Because I've done this once and it frightened the life out of me when I thought about it. That Restrepia got watered with a pH of 5.6. Where would that pH have been after 4 or 5 days? Probably below 5 and heading down into the 4s. It's not going to happen again. Ever. So, reevaluate. Yeah? I've tried something, I've thought about it, now I've got to think again. and it applies to certain sorts of media. Now I'm going to be nasty. If you've got bare-rooted plants, or you grow in inorganic, your river rocks, your lacabeads, your ceramis, no media at all, you've got the thing stood in a clay pot and it's just bare-rooted in an open wooden basket, you have no media to speak of, because the lava rocks and the river rocks and stuff like that, they're inert. They don't affect the pH of the water around them, and if they do, perhaps you ought to think about it. But fundamentally, that's why that sort of media, or lack of media, is used. So you lot can go away now, because this is meaningless to you. It's the same as if you grow in waterculture or semi-waterculture. What media is affecting your water? And the answer's none. So this is of no use to you whatsoever. Sorry if you hung around to this point, but you might change the way you grow things. You might change what you grow. You might have a go at a Masdevallia or something like that that needs to stay moist and, you know, quite honestly wouldn't do that well in an inorganic media and probably wouldn't do very well in waterculture. It might do okay, I don't know, I've never tried it. But for those of us who grow in organic media, depending on how new it is, whether it's got moss in it, because remember that moss is just acidic by nature. So just having moss in the pot is going to alter your pH, and I don't care if it's brand new or only 6 months old or a year old. The decay starts from the first time you water it, unless it's live moss, which I have no experience of, so I can't talk about it. So you need to stop and think now. My pH swing for my plants in moss and small bark is actually causing harm by doing it. So I won't be doing it anymore. What I will do is what I've always done, which is a very low level of feed. I mean, those type of plants like that Restrepia, I mean, they get about somewhere around 100, 120, 130 if I get it wrong, parts per million of feed. Sometimes I overcook my feed and I look at it and I think the difference is not worth faffing with. It'll do for this time. It's not an exact science. But they are low feeders. They do not like high levels of salts in their media. It messes the roots up, so they need to stay low. And we still go back to that bottom line. How much feed do orchids need? And the answer is not much, you know. Aim low rather than high. The guidelines are there. And that's what they are, guidelines based on people's experience. The more experience, the more times things have happened, the more valid it probably is, you know. But that's important to me, because now I can go back to pure water with a small amount of feed. Now that's going to take my TDS up to the value I just said for those types, for the Restrepia types. And that, you know, there's a fair few plants in that category that I've got. It's not a huge proportion of my orchids, but it's enough to worry about and not ignore. The small level of feed would naturally take my pH down to about 6.7, 6.8. Yeah? Now strictly speaking, that's too high. Yeah? The magic range is 5.5 to 6.5. So I'm feeding at a pH that's a little higher than I would like. Now I can choose to lower it with a bit of citric acid and say bring it down to 6.3, 6.4, but what's going to happen to it when it goes in the pot and sits there for a week? How low is it going to get? So I believe that for my plants in that type of media, I'm not going to mess that much with the pH. You know, I may well lower it to 6.4, 6.5 at my watering time. The pot will then do the work for me. All the nutrients available to that type of plant that are taken on board above 5.8 will be naturally available to the plant. And as time goes on, the pH will naturally drop because of the media. And as long as it drops below 5.8 before it runs out, and I can assure you that little plants like Restrepias and things are not going to use all of that feed in that amount of time. There will always be some in the pot, which is why they get flushed regularly. It's important. You've got to wash out the old stuff and start from a clean point again. And then the media will get straight at that flush water and start playing with it. Yeah? So bear in mind what media you use. And as I said, if you're growing in totally inert stuff that has no effect on pH whatsoever, and that includes bare-rooted to a degree, then this is not important to you. But if you grow in bark, yeah, depending on how much air is in round it, how fast it dries, how old it is, whether you've added moss in there, whether that plant needs to stay constantly moist, will affect the pH of the water that's in the pot, and it will naturally drop it down. And if in that particular Restrepia's case it can go down by 3 points on the pH scale in 24 hours, perhaps it might be interesting to see what comes out of that pot after a week. Bearing in mind that poor thing's been watered 2 days on the trot. It's absolutely soaking wet now. Hope we get some warmer weather. But you see what I'm getting at. You know, a little bit of knowledge can go a long way, but it needs to head in the right direction and be applied in practical terms. Yeah? The theory's all well and good, but you have to look at the real world as well and look at the practical side of things. And I must admit, when I thought about this pH swing, I thought that sounds absolutely brilliant. Yeah? I'm going to, in the description, because I've changed my ending on my videos, I'm not adding links to bloody videos and stuff. It's too much faff. You know, don't work hard, work smart. But what I can always do is put a link to something I think is important in my description. And all you've got to do is click on the link. It's a hyperlink, basically. It'll fire you off straight to that video. Yeah? So I'm going to put a link to Rick L's original video where the pH chart is shown. Now that video's not going anywhere, as far as I know, but what would happen if that video went missing for any reason? We'd lose our chart, wouldn't we? That's why I've already done a screen capture. It's on my computer now. That's where it's going to stay because it's important, yeah? So I'll put a link to that video that shows the original chart. And I mean, it's not Rick's original chart, I don't know where he got it from, but I don't think he actually produced it himself, but he constantly uses it and refers to it. So I would recommend you capture it in some way so that you've got a permanent copy. It's important. Important enough to do that, or I believe it is anyway. So that's that, and I'm going to put another link to one of Rick's videos on how to look after these things. Yeah? But do bear in mind, in my case, that's not a scientific instrument. And although rinsing it off before I store it is actually worth doing to preserve the life of that tiny little glass thing in the bottom, that is a very delicate piece of equipment, despite that not being a scientific instrument, it's worth looking after it. So it will get rinsed before it gets stored. If you go for the more expensive ones, and they've got instructions to do so, it does recommend that you store it in a calibrating fluid. Well, for me, that would provide a faff factor. Why? Well, because, you know, it would be so easy to cross-contaminate that calibration fluid. It would only need one drip of something on this that came out of there, you know, and my calibrating fluid would then be out. So I could be miscalibrating the unit. So I'm quite happy with this cheapo version that providing I rinse it, it's going to get stored dry and then it's ready for use. But that makes sense, doesn't it? Water and electrics don't go too well together. They tend to mess up, yeah? So storing them upright makes sense to me. I never used to do that, I just used to throw them on the table in there. But I'm quite happy to just lean them against the side of the unit now and store them upright. And any fluid that's left in there can just drain down to the bottom, yeah, and then they dry off. So look after your kit, it doesn't take a lot of effort. And, you know, try not to leave them flat when they're wet, you know. Especially don't leave them upside down, because the fluid that's inside this little base bit is going to try and flow. And where's it going to flow? Straight into where the electrics are. Yeah. When I'm using mine now, I do that. I don't know whether that's on shot, but I just lean them. Yeah. That way, any water that's on there is at least going to flow downwards and not up into the electrics. So look after your kit. But please bear in mind what's going to happen to your feed water and its pH after you've used it. What's happening in your pot? Yeah? And I can virtually guarantee that if you are using any form of organic media, the pH will drop. So where's it going to drop from and where's it going to drop to? Yeah? If I feed those little plants at quite a high pH, the pot's going to do the work for me long before the feed in the pot runs out. So I've got to stop the pH swing on those plants because I could be doing harm, especially in those in older media that stay wet, like the Ristrepia. It's on the list to get repotted towards the end of the year, not now. So have a think about that. Ooh. Right, I don't get down on my knees for much. They're getting old and tired, they're getting more delicate as age creeps in. As I've always said, it's getting down there is not a problem, it's the getting up bit. Yeah, so have just a think about that. That's not science, that's just a practical example of what happens in your pot after you've watered. And it's worth thinking about before you start playing around. Because at the point you pour your water in, it's known. Because you've just worked it out and tested it. You know exactly where you are. And you've got a big thumbs up and everybody's happy. But just consider what happens after you pour it in your pot. Yeah? And that goes from nothing, water culture, inorganic stuff, that, you know, to something. And that something could be quite dramatic. Yeah? It's got to be worth a bit of thought. So have a play with those thoughts then. I still say that adding some knowledge in that you didn't know can help. I know some will have trouble with an onslaught of knowledge which they didn't have at all, because you're trying to take on board absolutely everything. I already had the knowledge about the nutrient elements and what they do for the plants. I already had that. Nothing new there for me. The two things that are new for me are the pH value at which some of those nutrient elements are absorbed and in other cases blocked out. I didn't know that, now I do. I'll work with it. Do you know what the other thing is? The other thing is, I've completely forgotten. I'm just going to go and get my coffee. That's a senior moment. I haven't had one like that for a long time. I had two things. When I started filming, I thought we've got two things to say at the end. Don't forget to say this and that. And that has just gone totally out of my head. I'm going to walk away. I'll be back. Sorry about that. That doesn't happen often, but that needed a walk away and go back over thoughts that have happened in the past. Right. The other important thing that I've learnt recently is which nutrients are mobile and which nutrients are not. And I didn't know that, so again, that's a new bit of knowledge, and I will apply that accordingly. But generally speaking, the majority of my plants are in good health. There are a few rescues going on, which I might need to consider, but in the main, everything's doing okay. So for me, trying to up a certain element or down a certain element or doing that with a good balanced feed applied in an appropriate manner, I don't need to worry about those sort of things. But certainly where you've got sick plants that have come from unknown sources and you're working on trying to recover a plant, it might be important to know those things and know how to control them. Yeah? So it's a good piece of knowledge to have around in times when it's needed. And it won't be needed all the time, you know. But plants do different things, you know. If a plant's growing at a phenomenal rate, well, it's going to use more of certain elements than others, and you perhaps might want to give a little bit of a boost now and again, but know what you're doing. You know, if you overcook things, you probably do more harm than good, so go steady. Moderation at all times, don't go mad. Yeah? And bearing in mind, if you've got a general water that's got a pH of quite a bit higher than the 5.8, yeah? And you think, oh, that plant's got a calcium deficiency, one of the important flipping elements that doesn't move around. It gets dropped off at the plant where it's needed until there's none left, and that's where it stays. Yeah? So we've we've understood the principle of if you have an immobile shortfall, then it's going to show at the front end of the plant where the growth is. If you've got problems with a mobile element, it'll hit the back end of the plant first on the older parts. You know, so if you've got signs along those lines, you can deal with it appropriately. And you might want to boost an element now and again. But just remember what you're doing. If you're watering with a pH of around 6.5, what are you going to do if you add something like CalMag? You've added calcium and magnesium. You may have done something to the pH by adding that, so you'd need to check it and check that you haven't overcooked it with your TDS meter. Moderation at all times. So you think I've got a bit of a calcium deficiency, so I'll add some CalMag. Well, if your pH is at 6.5, what have you just done for calcium? Absolutely nothing. But what have you done? You've increased the magnesium quite dramatically on the grounds that that goes in at a higher pH. Careful what you're doing. Don't play with things you don't understand. A good balanced feed will do its job. And if you understand that, you know, the pH is important for which elements are absorbed, then you've got it. Don't go mad. Keep it simple. Yeah. So my feed is a good balanced feed specifically for my RO water. That's the other thing. Make sure your feed suits your water. That can mess things up too. But you know, if you're on the right lines, you know, and I still say if everything's doing fine, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But whenever I say that, I always qualify it. Everything seems to be doing fine, but could it be doing better with some small changes? Yeah, that's up to you. These are your choices, and I apply my new knowledge accordingly. But what I do need to go very careful about is using a pH that's already quite low in a pot where it's going to quite dramatically drop down from that point immediately after I've watered it. And where will it end up 4 or 5 days later? So it could be doing harm. Yeah, so take care, use your knowledge, yeah, and everybody's got some new knowledge, and as I said in the description I'll put a link to 2 videos that I think are important. One is that element chart, and the other one is how to look after your kit. Yeah, if you look after your kit, it will look after you. That makes sense to me. So I'll put links in the description to those 2 videos. I know Rick won't mind. He'll get all due credit, yeah. And you know, maybe somebody new may pop across to Rick's channel, and I'm all for that, you know. So there you go then. That's that little bit of pretend science, but there is some logic behind it and a practical example rather than just the theory. Yeah, so understand the media you use and the effect that media will have from nothing to quite dramatic depending on the media that you're using. See you again. Oh, I just want to add another bit on. People are showing concerns about my cough because it's been hanging around a while. Well, I'll explain. I live on my own. And if I didn't like that, I'd do something about it. But I do like it, so don't worry about that. You know, I've got people around me. If I want company, I can go and find it. It's only round the corner. I like my own company and working with my orchids. And weekdays, that tends to be what happens. Yeah, if you had an old car that you stored in the garage and it didn't get used, what's going to happen when you start it up at the weekend to give it a run? It's going to cough and splutter a bit, isn't it? Yeah? Well, that's what my voice is doing. Sometimes when I start filming, that's the first time my voice has been used for perhaps 48 hours. I don't go around talking to myself. It worries the neighbours. So you can see that sometimes when I'm filming, that's the first time I've spoken for a while, and it's like an old engine. It coughs and splutters a bit when it starts up, and it don't last long. It is just literally that. You know, as soon as you start speaking, you sort of start drying your throat a bit. That's all it is. It's a tickle. I'm not dying, you know, there's nothing going wrong here. And it isn't the residual cold. That has long gone. Yeah? It's just an old engine firing up for the first time. Please don't worry, but thank you for your concern. It's appreciated. But worry not. See you again.